All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third episode of Freethinker Fridays. My name is Nate Bander. I work in the Office of Admissions alongside my colleagues Natalie Waters-Siem, Ali Capasso, and Robin Hare. Today, we will be talking about racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion at Mountains Park Academy. And I am so excited to be joined by 5 fascinating and fantastic members of the MPA community. Before I introduce them, I wanted to share a little bit more about this topic and how it's relevant to today. So Mountains Park Academy, like nearly all other schools and MPA as a whole, has opportunities to grow in our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. We have come really far in our policies, practices, some of the lived experiences, but there's no mistake that we, just like society, have a long way to go. And striving to be diverse and inclusive is part of MPA's DNA. And we talk about diversity in a lot of different ways: socioeconomic, sexual orientation, diversity of thought, and racial diversity. And families come to us looking for an inclusive and a diverse community. We have 30 minutes today, so we're going to focus entirely on racial diversity, on equity and inclusion and racial justice, though this conversation could go on for much longer. When we made this schedule for Freethinker Fridays, we wanted to focus on conversations worth having. And given the last month and a half, this is certainly one of those. This is a conversation that is happening at MPA, and it's been happening this summer. And we have a concerted effort for the last 4 years, in fact, under the leadership of Head of School, Dr. Bill Hudson, to have that conversation. So a huge thank you to our panelists for joining us today and engaging on this important topic. In short, MPA, like America as a whole, has room to grow in our effort to be anti-racist. Today, our goal is to highlight the work and thoughts of these 5 anti-racist thinkers who are making an impact on our community. So some quick introductions. Dr. Thabiti Willis is the parent of Lana, who is a rising kindergartner. He is a professor of history and the director of Africana Studies at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. Tiffany Scott Knox, who is the parent of rising 4th grader Alex, is the executive director of the St. Paul Promise neighborhood. Salma El Masri, part of the MPA class of 2021, a rising senior, is the president of MPA's Social Consciousness Club and Racial Justice and Equity Club. Nasri Makhtal, a member of the MPA class of 2020 and future American University in Washington, D.C. student, is the co-founder of an organization called Female Refugees of the Future. And Katie Murr is an MPA parent to rising 9th grader Ben and rising 6th grader Josh, and a history teacher and debate coach who has been at MPA for 15 years. I'm so excited to be joined by these fantastic panelists. So to get us started, I would love to start with Salma and Nasri. Salma and Nasri, could you share just a little bit more about the work that Social Consciousness Club and Racial Justice and Equity Club have done this year and are doing this summer? Salma, maybe you can get us started on that.
Sure. So Social Consciousness Club and Racial Justice and Equity Club were originally 2 separate clubs that met on different days of the week during the school year to discuss different contentious global and domestic issues. We had more of a global focus than Social Consciousness Club did, than Racial Justice and Equity Club. But after the murder of George Floyd and a lot of the protests in our community, we felt that we had an obligation to continue meeting over the summer and not just during the school year. So we sort of combined both of the clubs and have been having weekly meetings, book club meetings, where we've been reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. But we worry that just reading alone is really performative. So we've been focusing on community actions and initiatives that we can pursue to ensure that we're leveraging anti-racist policies in MPA and beyond. So the first one is we're hoping to hold a lit drop campaign in the surrounding communities around MPA. One of our students looked at the voting numbers, and although Minnesota has the highest voter registration and turnout in the country, the neighborhoods surrounding MPA are about 10 points lower than the state average. So something that's really important to us is educating our neighbors about the importance of voting by mail safely to make sure that our neighbors aren't disenfranchised, because the vote is what will drive a lot of the change in policies that we're advocating for. So it's important to elect leaders that will advocate for those policies. And then Nasser can speak about some of the other initiatives that we've been proposing.
Yeah, I think one thing that I kind of wanted to mention was interesting. We initially had started off in partnership with also Asian Culture Cup in a hopes of kind of tackling the impacts of COVID on Asian Americans and also just other racial minorities in general. And we kind of found ourselves together in this one club because week after week, it felt like we were working on different police brutality cases. So first it started off with Ahmaud Arbery, and then it transitioned to Breonna Taylor, then Sean Reed, and then George Floyd. And after all of those murders that we found out about within, I would say, 3 weeks, both these clubs were making calls, signing petitions, sending emails, and it kind of flourished into the anti-racist work because it just felt like week after week, it was a new case, a new person, a new name, somebody else that was dead that shouldn't have been. And so that's kind of what led to this work.
Nasri, do you want to also, if you don't mind, sharing a little bit more about the organization that you co-founded and how that's helping guide your anti-racist work?
Yeah. So Priya Amanda and I, who's also a member of the class of 2020, co-founded an organization called Female Refugees of the Future, FRF for short. And so basically with that organization, we try to promote equality and equity between first-generation immigrant and refugee women. And so through that, we provide resources. And our new initiative that we're working on is trying to provide therapy for these young women, because oftentimes in these communities, specifically the community that we're working in Cedar, it is oftentimes mental health is stigmatized, and women coming from these identities often carry such a burden. And so this new initiative of trying to provide them with therapy, is kind of trying to destigmatize needing mental health. And a lot of the women that we are working with are women of color. And so that is also what's leading our anti-racist work, because we're not only working with immigrant women, but we're also working with immigrant women who are women of color.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to you both for representing MPA in this way. Switching gears a little bit, I'd love to get the perspective of Professor Willis and Tiffany on a little bit more about this notion of anti-racism in schools. You know, you are both parents of young children, who attend MPA, but in your professional lives as well, whether it's at Carleton or whether it's working closely with the St. Paul Public Schools, what are some characteristics that you've seen of anti-racist schools? And how does that, what's sort of the track towards working towards anti-racism? And Professor Willis, maybe you can jump in first.
Thank you so much. So our list of about 5 or 6 characteristics that I think are really helpful, right? So one is to recognize, has to start with the notion that racism exists, it's structural, it's embedded within our institutions, our policies, our practices, and traditions, right? And so thus the work of anti-racism begins with that assumption, or recognizing those, and then working to how do we begin to change our traditions, right? How do we have a vision that provides a whole nother way of engagement, et cetera, right? I would say 2, that history matters, right? That 3, I think resisting the love affair with normalcy, right? And that is, really the notion that we have to recognize that the normal is what we have to work against, right? And if we get so comfortable and complacent with the normal, then it's hard to have the kind of energy, the kind of clarity, the vision, and the commitment to doing the daily work, right? Which is what I would say is a 3rd, if not a 4th element, that this is daily work, right? And 5, that it's a journey, right? That it's not a destination, it is a journey. It's something that, we're continuing to work at over and over again, because we exist in a larger society and in a world wherein right? You know, as I was saying, this is baked into our institutions, our practices, our policies. So I'll stop there, please, Tiffany.
Yeah, absolutely.
You actually took all of my talking points, but one thing I just wanted to add, because it makes sense. We're super aligned. One thing I would love to share is a story. And I stumbled across this newly in my role at St. Paul Providence neighborhood, and we were talking about systems change. And Dr. Willis, you probably heard this story before, but two fish were swimming along, going around, you know, swimming around in the water. They met an older fish, and who nods and says, you know, good morning, boys. How's everything going? And how's the water? And the two young fish, you know, they look perplexed and they're like, okay, kind of shrug it off. They keep going. Later on, the two younger fish look at each other and say, what is water? Right? And so I think, you know, the simple awareness, and you already talked about this, is being aware, knowing what's going on, and what is hidden in plain sight. I think, especially for those who are not experiencing, is one thing to be, you know, brown and black and kind of deal with these struggles early on. But if you're not aware, or even your circle of influence are not dealing with these issues, you wouldn't even know what's happening. And so I wanted that story, you know, really to illustrate the awareness piece. And, you know, I think, I can't remember who mentioned this, but I think it's perfect for us to say, you know, I have been so feeling a lot of love about the statements that are going out by organizations and companies that we love about Black Lives Matters. And even going further, saying, oh, we've hosted our staff internally. But if it starts and ends there, is performative, which somebody else says. And it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We have to keep the work going. And so I think in my experience, and I won't take up too much time, but very much echoing what you have already said, is that it starts in your personal journey. And normally administration, organizations, let their staff have room to unpack, understand, learn, and acknowledge, you know, their own world views. They have to unpack that, and it has to be, again, from the administration. I think from there, you're able to look a little bit deeper and think about, in my experience in HR, we talk a little bit about the ideal fit. And I've always encouraged folks not to use that language. And so as we think about students and teachers, really dig deep on what the ideal student is and what that looks like. Examine materials and content in your classrooms. And then, you know, we could talk about this more in depth, but I really do believe finding and implementing an anti-racist pedagogy is super, super important. And then again, make a concrete plan to implement change. And so that's kind of what my thoughts are and what we've been doing in my work.
Well, yeah, a lot of things that schools and all of us who exist within this this culture and this country can work to improve ourselves as anti-racists. So before I jump in and invite Katie Murr to share a little bit more on this topic, I want to make sure that those watching us on Facebook Live, if you have questions, please type those in the chat. They do come to us, and we'll be able to answer those. So we love and encourage questions. Before I jump into a question for Katie, a quick note on sort of this idea of performative versus really truly weighted statements and truly weighted actions. And I think that's something that schools can get lost in, is saying things like Black Lives Matter, but not going further than that. And so, you know, I know that we at MPA are, and this is something that Dr. Hudson and the Board of Trustees are developing, we are creating an action group. It doesn't have a name yet, but it's going to be kind of being developed over the summer to ensure that action is taken, to ensure accountability, to ensure change on this. And so I'm proud, you know, as an MPA alum, I'm proud as an employee here that work is being done. Specific, concrete things are going to happen, changes based on what we've all taken in over the last couple of months. So, Katie, if I can ask you, as a teacher at MPA, especially as a history teacher in the upper school, you have this duty to put forth an inclusive curriculum, a representative curriculum, and I think back to my time at MPA, and it was reading things like Their Eyes Were Watching God, or reading Richard Wright's Native Son, or reading The Late Homecomer by Kaukalia Yang. What is it in, that was 11 years ago now, in your work, what is it that you are doing to make sure that there's that representative curriculum, that inclusive curriculum? And I'll leave it open-ended from there.
The first thing, it's not just my work. I think that's what's really important, and not but it's that it's not just seen as the work of the U.S. history teacher. I think that there's a broad-based commitment amongst the faculty to make sure that these issues are not just addressed in a single course that students will someday get to. So, English is looking at what they're teaching, and maybe 10 years ago, the social studies department decided to switch from a very traditional Western civilization kind of approach to history, and said 2 years of world history to make sure that we get the breadth of world history and we broaden our perspectives. But in my class, one thing that I think is really important is not to take sort of the Black History Month approach, for lack of a better characterization, to teaching about race. So it's not as if today is the day that we will talk about race and then we won't talk about it again. I think students would say that these are issues that they expect to grapple with in sort of any lesson or at any point in time, and that even if it's not raised explicitly by me, there is an awareness of that, and that it's a thematic awareness, I guess you could say. So concepts like the color line, like resistance, like the architecture of racism, like the idea that race is not biologically real but socially constructed with policies, all of those kinds of things are repeatedly addressed so that students really grapple with them with some depth. The other thing I wanted to piggyback on was Dr. Willis's point about we have to resist normalcy. And one thing that I was thinking about as a teacher is to be able to resist normalcy, you have to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations. Like you have to be used to that. And intellectually, I think we can teach students that. So we can put them in carefully constructed discomfort. Let me show you this disconnect at this point in history. Let's wrestle with this. What does this mean when the values are one thing and the actions are another? And what does that require of people? And if you ask students to challenge those things and to look at those things again and again and again, I think that's really important. And the other thing that I think about, an example that Nasri taught me, is to teach with humility. As a white woman teaching US history, I think I need to be open about that and acknowledge that with my students, and that when I make mistakes, I need to openly acknowledge that. So at one point in time when I was teaching Nasri US history, I made a comment about expanding the voting rights for women. And I just said, women gained the right to vote in 1919. And she said, no, white women gained the right to vote in 1919. And my job there as a teacher is to acknowledge my mistake and to have, I think, the humility to do that. And it sounds like it's like bragging about humility, but we have to do that as teachers, right? And to be taught and to learn and then to be better. And I think that's another thing that our faculty is really striving to do.
Yeah, thank you. And, we can't, I wish we had the luxury of hosting this from within your classroom, because the walls of your classroom and Nasri and Salma and maybe others know what I'm talking about are it's like a museum in there with all the most fascinating different historical artifacts, and it's so cool. So that's all. That makes learning in your classroom pretty fun. Switching gears a little bit, and this goes back to Nasri and Salma. You both are towards the end of your MPA education. Nasri, you've already graduated. Salma, you're a rising senior, and so you've had this experience speaking. Let's say that you're speaking to a younger student, or speaking to someone who doesn't yet go to MPA or something like that. What are some ways that a student who comes to MPA, who's going to have the privilege of an exceptional education, what can that person do to impact and improve the lives of people in the broader community? And you have both done clear examples of this, but if you're going to give some of those concrete recommendations, or some kind of take that down and dilute it down into one or two things, what would be those things of how to get involved?
Yeah. I can say some things. I know this sounds like pretty obvious, but just making the most of your education, like you said, Nate, Vander, MBA education really is tremendous, and it's not like every other student gets that education. And so if you really use all the resources that you have to the most of your ability, and I know for me, like I began my advocacy work within MPA, and that's how I became, that's how I got into the work that I do now. It was through using my resources like my teachers, using the education I got from Miss Murr's history class or from Miss Moan's AP Ling class, and just really like using, like I said, using the resources that you have, because if you do want to get into the advocacy work, MPA is a great place to start because they really do afford you all the opportunities that you need.
Thank you. Salma, good.
I'll say that part of being an activist or an advocate is that while you're learning these things that it might be in history or from your peers, or if you're reading and trying to educate yourself on the history of the systematic nature of racism, is to ensure not just to look within yourself and learn these things, but to use what you learn to leverage and influence the policies that lead to this. So that means that, that's how you make sure that it's not performative, because the education is super powerful, but it only means something if you take that out into your community and you look at how it directly relates to you. And I think that's exactly what we did when we're reading the book, Kendi's book. There are lots of parallels from his anecdotes that I could draw from Miss Murr's history classes. And then what we did is we looked outward into our community and how we observed all of these patterns. And then the question that we asked ourselves was, okay, how can we put it in the best interest of our community to adopt these policies that we're advocating for? And that's how you build a strategy and figure out how to be persuasive and encourage those in your community to join your side and adopt that policy. And that's exactly what I think we're doing in SCC and what Nasri has done for years as an illustrious activist, and what many others are doing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, some days I worry about what's going to happen in the future, and then some days I hear Salma and Nasri speak, and it feels a lot better. So I think I speak for all of us when I hear that. A quick reminder, with about 8 minutes left, if there are those who are watching on Facebook Live, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you'd like to share or respond to anything that we've said, we would love to have you. That's certainly that interactive piece is what makes Facebook Live such a great platform. So please chime in, whatever is on your mind. The next thing that I'd like to focus on is going back to Professor Willis and Tiffany, as well as parents of young kids. How are you what kind of tools are you using, strategies, language, as you talk both in your professional lives and with your own children about race? And we all have heard of the important discussions that Black parents have to give their children because of the world that we live in. And, I think it's important to share a little bit more on kind of what advice you have in that, but also in what advice maybe white parents should be having for conversations they should be having with their children. So I'll once again leave that open-ended. And Tiffany, maybe you can jump in and share some information that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. In my house, I always joke and laugh that I call a thing a thing. We don't sugarcoat certain things. My son was 8 years old when he was first racially discriminated against. He was in a store, somebody accused him of stealing, and she said, "Those you kids always steal." So 8, and we were not ready to have that conversation with Alex, but it happened. And so one of the things that I've learned is that you have to talk about it. You have to call a thing, and you have to talk to your kids early and often about it, especially now, right? If you have news on it any time, you have to talk about it. And this is not new. And so ignorance is not bliss in this case, right? So this has been going on for over 400 years. And the reason why I say that, and Nate, you said this, it's not just for Black kids or people of color to talk about, it's also for our white peers. You guys are going to school with my son and embracing him as well. And so I need that spirit to be nurtured. And so I always, anybody at MPA who knows me, I talk to every teacher about race. So all the time. And I think when I first met Nate in the door, that was one of my first questions when I first met Nate. So I think So just emphasize, you know, I talk about it, I talk about what has happened in the past, but I also talk about my hope for the future. And because that's also important. And then I think, you know, it's important for people to purchase and have diversity within their home. So toys, books, all of that, not just to, I think it represents the country, but then it also has an opportunity for the kids or the children to ask questions, right? We want them to be curious. We're raising strategic and critical thinkers. That's what we want. And, you know, again, check in often. I mentioned we have the news on. Your kids are brilliant. They're observant, and they need space to process, you know, what's going on in the world. And again, you know, over this past 2 months, I have been super, super raw, a little bit more vulnerable than I like, and sharing and being a little bit more emotional. And I don't hide that emotion from my kids. It's important that they see that. And then I think it, like, you know, Kate mentioned, it's okay to be comfortable. We may not have all the answers, but just like anything, I always tell Alex and Ava, I don't know. That's a good question. Let's research it. Let's do it together. And I think that's an opportunity that we have. And so I'm so sorry it took up a little bit more time, but Dr. Willis.
No, you've said it wonderfully. And I just only want to, you know, support what it is that you've already highlighted. I think truth telling is essential, right? I think there are some uncomfortable truths that that we invite and we train young people from, you know, a young age to tell the truth, right? And I think that we have to talk about, what does that look like? What does masking, hiding, collapsing, obfuscating the truth look like in adults, right? So thus, you know, we have to talk about our traditions. We have to give them knowledge and exposure, right? We have to talk about, you know, figures like Columbus, for instance, or the founding fathers, right? And humanize and talk about how complicated people are and the decisions people have made, right? And so I think those are some crucial elements of it. I would also say, you know, I think this is something that we are quite good at here in the Twin Cities area, is the encouragement of the arts, right? That the arts provide a really powerful medium of engagement. 1 minute, please. A really powerful medium. I know. Can you hold on 1 second? I'm making a point on Facebook Live. A really powerful medium of engagement with the creative, with our own creative capacities, etc. And I'm going to defer at this moment forward. Thank you.
And we can say hello to Lana. Well, thank you to you both. And I actually, you know, with Tiffany bringing up a little bit about what, you know, white families who are numerous in Minnesota, in the United States, in MPA. Katie, do you have two now middle school and an upper school age sons? Do you want to just take maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds and give us kind of the elevator speech on what you have shared with your boys as someone who has this perspective of being a history teacher?
Sure. I shared Tiffany's philosophy of I don't hide things from my kids. I also think as a white family, we have to recognize that we have the privilege of, in theory, not talking about this. And so my philosophy is, some people will say children are too young to talk about these issues. My children have that privilege, but not everybody's families have that privilege. So I see it as a responsibility to talk about this so that from a very young age, my children, however clumsy and mistaken they may be, sometimes are at least talking about these issues and recognizing that they are issues and that they have a responsibility to answering these issues as well. So like, I'm encouraging my kids to go to social consciousness, to talk about these things. So I just think it's thinking about privilege and what that allows me to do and what I can't allow myself to do.
Thank you. We have about 1 minute left, and we did get a question on Facebook Live, and I think this is a great one to navigate, because a lot of independent schools, public schools, colleges and universities are all talking about this. MPA does have a faculty and staff that is majority white, that's overwhelmingly white, as Carlin says. And you know, I've been an advocate for, and I've been joined by many of my peers in advocating for more teachers and faculty of color. And I'm proud to say that we have made a big change in our philosophy on hiring and brought in consultants to make that happen. And so as we are bringing in our next generation of amazing MPA teachers, this will be something that is first and foremost on our mind, and that is important. Representation matters. There's no two ways about it. And so, you know, speaking on behalf of someone who works at MPA, we know this. We recognize that we're working towards it. I am seeing the little timer counting over 30 minutes right now, meaning that we are at the 12:30 mark. There is so much to be discussed on this, and we have just this time limitation before people continue on their Fridays. So I want to thank Nasri, Salma, Professor Willis, Tiffany, Katie, for your time, your perspective. I'm so proud to share this perspective and kind of this side of MPA, and so I thank you. We have smart people who are thinking about anti-racism and thinking about how to improve the school, and I know it's in amazing hands. So with that, we are going to leave our live discussion. Thank you to all who tuned in, and I look forward to our next Friday's discussion as well. Have a great weekend, everybody.